Hey, hi, Isaac.
Rapa, good morning.
Good morning to you. Very exciting.
Yes,
We're
it is.
uh,
So we are on verse 24.
in the Galilee. Yeah. So the second verse, and we're gonna get like our a very exciting list today. So okay, let's get started.
The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 4, verse 24. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them.
So where did you say that the news spread?
Throughout all Syria.
Oh, you said Syria. Okay, I thought you said
Well,
something.
did I say something else?
I thought. I mean, we could listen to the recording after to see, but
Okay.
I thought you said something. Okay, throughout all Syria. Okay, so this is a really great example. This is not the only time, obviously, that Jesus heals, but it's I think one of the more famous times. In that this is like the verse that generalizes like all the kinds of healing. Okay, so Isaac, what do you think about this verse?
This
Jesus,
is a this
Jesus.
is a this is the first time in the gospel that he's healing people, that he's healing, or we no, there's that the gospel states that he healed all those who were sick and those who were afflicted with various pains and diseases. Now
Right.
now
Aside from the verse right before it.
Yeah, so that was, so the earlier verse was, I think we discussed, where the healing was in the hearing, as the gospel was preached, and in that hearing there was healing. And I think this sounds like actual physical healing, as in he did a miracle of.
Oh, I think in the last one, it's implied that there's actual healing as well. I
Mhm.
just was noting the dual meaning of that. Like it would be hard to understand that he cured every disease and every sickness among the people to not include some form of actual physical sickness when the next verse lists the sicknesses. So I definitely don't think we should exclude the fact that he cured physical sicknesses here. I think it's just that it's meant to be a double entendre that,
Mhm.
yeah, he cured sickness. What's your sickness? Maybe you don't know the kingdom of heaven's here,
Mhm.
but also that you're epileptic.
So so he was famous. His fame spread around.
Right.
But I'm
So,
I'm surprised it doesn't mention Galilee, it doesn't mention Judea, but mentions Syria.
okay. So
And
let's
this
go,
is the first,
right.
yeah.
So let's start with the first point. So it says his fame spread. And if you look at, there's a lot of different translations. The report about him went out, the fame went throughout. When you look up the actual Koine Greek word, it more means the hearing of him went out. But I do think, again, there'll be this double entendre that one thing that Jesus is supposed to be able to do is what? Bring the good news throughout the world. And I think that while the Koine Greek is not identical to say that this is news, I think that we're definitely supposed to imply that Jesus, if anything, in this very moment is bringing the good news. And you could argue, just like we said before, that sickness could both be a physical and spiritual malady. But I think there's no doubt that the good news would be included here. So I think it's really cute that we see this idea of the spreading of the good news in a physical form and in a spiritual form. In this case, even though the Greek word only meant that there was a hearing of this. Okay, so now you're noting Syria. So this is a big question. What is Syria? So if you say today, we know Syria is that country right next to Lebanon, north of Israel, next to Jordan, next to Iraq, not next to Iraq, but next to those countries. So the question is not why does it say Syria? Because Syria, just to be clear, Syria could mean anywhere from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates. It could mean the Roman province of Syria, which was to the east and north of the Galilee. So
Mhm.
I think and then there's actually someone found a manuscript that says it just means the region of Galilee, and that's a mistake to say Syria. But putting aside all those questions, it means somewhere close and not Galilee. The question is, why does it say this? Where would we want it to say? Tell me what we have hoped this text would have said.
I, I would have expected this to say that his fame spread throughout Galilee and the region surrounding Galilee and probably Judea,
Right.
maybe.
So Galilee, you could argue that he was already. It said he went throughout Galilee. So you
Mhm.
could argue that that's implied that his fame spread. But at 100%, I would have hoped number one to spread throughout the world. That's the first line. But if not the world, I want the Chinese and the Mexicans on both sides of the opposite sides of the world, both to be fully aware of the good word that Jesus, right? And to heal their sick.
Amen. Okay,
Yeah,
good. Let's.
it's funny. Like you can imagine him just like, sometimes when we think of a eclipse, we just think the whole world goes black. You can imagine a time where Jesus just like spreads his hands and the whole world gets healed. That doesn't happen though, right? You kind of have to be like in eye contact or immediate, or he has to know you or whatever. But what we would have hoped to say the whole world, and if not the whole world, we would hope to say Judea, like you said. This is ludicrous that this is
Okay.
Syria. When it says Syria, even if, by the way, most people hold Matthew was written in Antioch or somewhere in Turkey, so that would have been Syria. So you could say it's spread. One simple answer why it's Syria, it's spread to us. We knew about it, and I think that's a fine answer. You could totally accept that, but I think there's a deeper, I'm not gonna use the word subversive, but secret agenda happening here that I keep pointing out. That John the Baptist was executed either before, eventually, and he was because he was acting subversively, he was undermining the government, other elements. And I think any of his followers would have been deemed to be under that rubric of that negative attitude. And I think to say that he was spreading the message amongst the Jews in Judea would have been a mess. It would have been absolutely disastrous, especially, if this was written right after the temple was destroyed and the Romans were hyper aware of Jewish efforts in the end of the first century. I think Syria is the way to say it wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't him trying to get every Jew to be messianic and to think of an apocalyptic eschatological end. It was literally him being this awesome guy who spreads the word. So I think that the reason it says Syria is to try to calm down the text and say, don't worry about the text.
So, well, thank you for that. So it sounds like two things happened. That most of John's disciples were now followers of Jesus, or they were with Jesus, and so
We don't,
that.
we don't know.
Well, that's and
If anything, you could argue the text says against that because he has to collect these 4 or 5 disciples.
yeah.
If anything, John had the crowds and or the Pharisees and or the Sadducees. So I wouldn't agree with that necessarily that he took on all disciples, but I'd say he took on the mantle of the movement.
So the reason why I mentioned that is because in terms of in Matthew, there's a very limited connection between Jesus and John, or the interaction is limited to only a few verses. Now, if Jesus moved to Syria because of he was viewed.
Moved to Galilee.
Sorry, he moved to Galilee, and the author meant to say that his fame spread to Syria, as in possibly also because of Jesus' association with John. Then, from that I was making is it possible to make the informed assumption that some of John's disciples were with Jesus, or they were in his crowd and they followed him, and that probably.
It's very interesting that the text doesn't offer any disciples ever, and Jesus officially, even though I definitely, bless you, I definitely view him as a disciple. And in the day, he's not cast as a disciple of John and Matthew. He's cast as a form of John is the precursor to the Jesus guy, and Jesus is the main point. So I think John, if anything, is somewhat of a throwaway, and I think this is where we keep mixing up history versus theology versus what's happening, because I keep throwing in there's something happening behind the text of John and Jesus, and I keep speculating, and we can't be sure, but we do have like other texts specifically about John in Josephus. It tells us about them, and we actually have 2 texts about John and Josephus, and we could read that one time. But overall, I keep speculating about that relationship. But if anything, Matthew is not worried about the historical relationship of John to Jesus. They're worried about the theological relationship.
I see. So now, is Syria, is this a Jewish country or is this a Gentile land?
So so it's a Gentile land.
Yeah.
But there would be Jews living there. Specifically, Jews were spread out throughout the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Some people estimate that over 1 million Jews lived in different places, especially Rome. They found more, I forgot how many, like 20 synagogues in Rome from late antiquity.
So,
and yeah.
So what does it say then, right? His first 2 disciples, the evangelist was explicit to mention the Greek names.
I just think there's 2 options which way you go. You either go to Judea, which is a no-go, or you go to Syria. And what's interesting, it doesn't say he went to Syria, where you think Matthew's written. It says, and the word spread to Syria, and they brought to him all the sick. So if anything, you could see like almost a migration people from Syria, not necessary to live there permanently, but it's really cute that one of the things, just so you know, that the Messiah accomplishes is that he collects people from around the world to move to Israel. And it's actually, again, like I don't know if anyone would say this is not really happening because it's not a permanent move, but
Mhm.
definitely I'm almost surprised that there's not a prophecy fulfillment here saying, and Jesus brought all the people from Syria and cured them. He collected all the people from the four corners of the world and they all came to Israel for this moment.
Yeah.
That would have been an amazing prophecy fulfillment.
So well, thank you for noting that people moved from Syria to Galilee, or to where Jesus was.
Visited. I didn't
Yeah,
say
visited. So they
yeah.
visited, right? So were these folks Gentiles, or were they all, or were they mostly Jewish? Because if they were
I,
Gentiles, that's a whole different. It gives a whole different flavor and a color to the text versus saying that they were mainly Jewish folks who was.
we can't answer that question. We can only point out that in verse 423, it says he's preaching the synagogues and word would have spread amongst the Jewish people because he's in synagogues. That being said, whenever you hear there's a miracle worker and he's actually able to execute those miracles, Jew, Gentile, dog, cat, whatever, anyone would go and be able to access those miracles if the miracle worker allows it.
Well, so that's the point. If the miracle worker allows it, because later on in the text, Jesus has this distinction between him coming to the Jews versus him serving the people in Samaria, people in Gentiles. And so, again, having seen how the story unfolds, I was intrigued if these folks were mainly Jewish, or if the author just completely brushed the fact this is both Jewish and Gentiles, and a mixed, and again a
I
mixed
think
bag
that's
of
something
people
that
from.
we're just gonna have to take note of throughout this text. Most people hold that Matthew was written. I mean, some people hold that Matthew was almost like a Jewish text, but also an anti-Jewish text, and that after the temple was destroyed and the rabbis were trying to kind of like recreate Judaism in their own image in a way that specifically was not taking into consideration the temple anymore, there would have been schisms of Judaism trying to kind of like form leadership. And Christianity would have been, at least in the end of the first century, one of the movements that lost out to rabbinic Judaism. And rabbinic Judaism would have been able to create infrastructure, create ideologies and underlying philosophies that they were trying to take from the early Pharisaic movements. But this would have been in contradistinction and in contrast to the Christian movements. So the Matthean community is going to try to say, we're Jews, but we're rejecting what's happening, I guess, in this case, in Yavne or in Usha and other places where the rabbis fled in the Galilee and also in Judea after the destruction of the temple. So this is something we always have to keep into consideration, that they want to be Jews, but they don't want to be rabbinic Jews. It's definitely a very important point for us to know.
So, okay, so I'm sorry, what is the dividing line between being Jewish versus being rabbinic Jew or rabbinical Jews? What is the dividing line between them?
So I can make you a list. So, when Josephus talks about three movements going on in his time period, namely the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, that would be in Jews, three groups. So there's no shortage of Jewish groups in any time period. And there's a whole history called parting of the ways, which is the way that Christianity over 400 years until it, like I guess Council of Nicaea or at different points till it fully broke. But there's always Jewish elements. And I think the best place you see this also is in those early Christian communities in Africa, where they believe they're Jewish even till today, like in Ethiopia, possibly Nigeria, where they most likely historically were groups of Christians, but they didn't have the Christian ideology superimposed upon them because they're in Africa. And Africa a lot of times doesn't get the same level of proselytization and evangelization that the rest of the world gets. So today, Israel has a right of return for Ethiopians because they view them as Jews, because Ethiopians self-identify as Jews, even though they had some Christian customs. And a lot of times some historians will see those Ethiopians as specifically Christian communities, but who are very early. So if they're early, they'll have a lot of Jewish customs. They'll still have a mezuzah on their door. They still might say, like, you can't have sex with a menstruating woman. They might say you don't eat pig. Well, a lot of these things specifically get abrogated throughout Christianity. And I think a lot of times it almost is like how evolutionary theory works when islands break off. And Darwin sees a pigeon looking like this in one place. So a lot of times Christian communities will be different, not because they're inherently different, because when the church was set up and then the proselytizer left, and then the people kind of have a syncretic religion left over, they'll include Buddhist traditions or Hindu traditions or Chinese traditions or African traditions, depending on where they are. And I think this is how you expect religion to evolve. So a lot of times when we look at the Christian groups, we have to take a step back when we try to think of a ubiquitous Christianity taking place in the first, second, third, and fourth century. A lot of times, even when the Church of James versus the Church of Paul, which would have been competing in the in the end of the first century, would have been very different attitudes towards Jews, towards pagans, towards non-Jews, towards Antomianism. So these are all things that we always have to take into consideration. Let me ask you a question on the verse. Why is Jesus healing?
He's a miracle worker. What else would you expect of him to do, right? I mean,
Okay, let me see a
isn't it by
list.
definition a miracle worker should heal?
He could bring rain. He could bring wealth. He could bring kids. I'll give you no problem. You give me a miracle. Give me a magic genie. I'll give you 1,000 miracles. What
Well, I
he
think,
specifically does is cure the sick.
yeah.
That's the
So
point. In both verses, he doesn't only cure the sick. He cures those afflicted with disease, pains, demons. Like, this is the thing he's doing. He's not doing all miracles here. He's curing the sick. So Isaac, I'm going to ask you again. Why does Jesus care about curing the sick?
well, because it's the social gospel, Christianity. So no. So well, I meant it. So so in some ways, right, this goes back to the three temptations, as he will use his power to flaunt it or to do something to glorify his name, or if he uses for something of value, of helping others, of making a difference. And as a Christian, I read this saying, Jesus could do all kinds of things. He could have converted stone into bread. He could have fallen down, but he used his God-given power, whatever he had, his miracle-working power, to save those who couldn't help themselves. As some people were sick, they were in pain, and he used his power to bring hope and to give them a new life. And to me, that's a model of servant leadership, of him exemplifying servant leadership and using his talents and using the God-given talents and gifts for something bigger than just satisfying a personal ego and personal pride.
So let me frame what you said maybe a little bit differently, to say the same thing, but maybe to open up an idea that the idea of the servant leader, or the person who's serving the people, or a person who's executing on behalf of the people, it's nice he's doing that, but would you say he's acting as a Messiah here? Would you say he's acting messianically? One of the questions we haven't discussed, and I purposely don't discuss, because I don't think it helps us. I think we want to open our eyes to the text of Matthew. But in Judaism, there's definitely different models of what a Messiah accomplishes. And not only that, in Christianity, I would say there's different models of what a Messiah can accomplish. And this is why, even to this day, we kind of wonder, when we look at Jesus' life, how is he the Messiah? What does he accomplish? Is it just like we spoke about, he's just born this way? But one of the things I think that we could argue, that in a messianic era with a Messiah, one of the things that is believed, according to certain traditions, is that it will be disease-free. We specifically see that, I think, in Corinthians 15:42. We see in Revelations 21:4, and various verses throughout the Bible. We see that this idea that you're going to live in a magic era. You're going to live in a world free of disease. And I think when you think of messianic era, I think we do think of that. It's not only going to be war-free and a peaceful time, but it's going to be a time of plenty, a time when you don't have sickness. And if you think of imperial Rome, the Roman Empire, and you think about what was probably the worst thing that they experienced, I would say it was disease. One specifically with the urbanization of the Roman Empire, and specifically with the various wars and bringing back the diseases from those wars through like all the various ways that you get diseases by conquering different places. One of the biggest pains in the world, physically, literally, symbolically, would have been actual lots of diseases. And it's really interesting. We have a list of diseases here. I didn't need a list. I didn't care about a list. But I think the reason a list is brought here is because what we're seeing is that when you think of the various things that would have been lacking in that time period, the thing that they had the least control of, the thing that they would have wanted a miracle the most for, is to heal their diseases. And I think that Jesus is acting on two fronts here. Number one, he's acting, he's saying the kingdom of heaven is here. We should live in a messianic time. And if you don't have diseases, that is an element of a messianic time. So check.
So well, thank you for that. If that is the case, right, wouldn't that have been tied to a prophetic verse, right? Wouldn't
Well,
they say, "Oh, the prophecy is being fulfilled," and wouldn't have the evangelist say, "Oh, the prophecy is
So
fulfilled."
first of all, I love that you're saying that, because I think you're thinking Matthew in there. But I just pointed out even the line before that it would be great to have a prophecy fulfillment. So I don't think you and I can ask questions and say, I would have loved the prophecy fulfillment. Why didn't Matthew write it? I think we could only do the reverse. When there's a prophecy fulfillment, we could take note of it and try to understand what he's trying to say.
Okay, let me put it this way: can you think of a possible reason why Matthew did not include a verse to say that this was a prophetic fulfillment. We do not
Yeah,
know
yeah.
why.
I think that Jesus is viewed as the Messiah in 1,000 ways. And again, I think every verse we could find a prophecy fulfillment, especially if we're going to use prophecy fulfillments out of context, which is what we do every time. So again, like, I don't know what is beating a dead horse. Again, like, I don't think we're allowed to ask that question when there should be an additional one. I think that it's just a question that's anathema to us. So I can't ever answer that. But I do think, on the one hand, it is acting messianically. But on the other thing, what we see that it does, it spreads his fame, it spreads his word. So you could argue that they're only coming, they don't care about Jesus, they care about the miracle worker. But I think most Christians who read this, they say it's showing that it's spreading word that he's not really the Messiah. Because the only reason he's really a miracle worker is because he's the Messiah. So it's viewed as proof is in the pudding. There's,
So
yeah.
it sounds like we're equating Messiah to a miracle worker. By being a miracle worker, he's a Messiah, and because he's a Messiah, he's a miracle worker. And so it sounds like you're saying that one way evangelist wants us to know is that because he was a miracle worker, doing miracles which nobody else could do, this implies that he is the Messiah. Is that what I'm trying to say?
I mean, what do you think?
So firstly, I had not again. I didn't look at this from the context of the Messiah. I looked at this as in just the human person of Jesus and his miracles. But that's a good perspective. And again, I'm learning to see him as a Messiah. Given the verses we've read, given the context we've had so far, um, I would want to. I mean, wouldn't I kind of want to say so? They've been miracle workers all along. Now, it's hard to say that Jesus was the only miracle worker, right? I mean, is that
I was noting that there's a famous guy called Honi, the circle maker, who also
yeah?
lived in the first century.
So there should be something much more to than a miracle worker to be a Messiah, because Messiah is, I look at this as, it's something bigger, it's something,
Well,
the long awaited one.
Luke does add a little bit. You look really close to Luke. He adds a couple lines, and all in the crowd were trying to touch him.
Yeah.
But power came out from him, and he healed all of them. So Luke actually is the only one of the three gospels of the synoptics that actually explains how the curing took place. I was joking yesterday, and joking, I was noting that in Jewish tradition, there's no idea of the miracle worker doing a miracle independent of a physical reality or a spiritual reality. So, for example, Choni Ma'agel, he has to ask God to bring rain, and then that's how he brings rain. His miracle working is never attributed to himself. So it's really interesting in Luke. What is this? I don't know what this is. Wherever this is, and all
14,
it's.
four, four,
Is it 419? I don't know what it is.
414.
Okay. And all in the crowd are trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed him. So again, like, I would argue that is like you could say this is not in Matthew, but again, I would say that is a messianic kind of action, and that is not a regular miracle worker, or maybe that's how miracle workers. I can't prove it. It's really interesting. And what also is added in Luke, it's the next verse. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multiple of people. So we see, like you were saying, that maybe there were disciples, but we just don't see that at all in Matthew or Mark at all right now. But one
Well,
thing
not
yeah, sorry.
Thank you for that. Now that I think about this, given the previous verse, where in the earlier verse in 23 it said that's the first place where it says the kingdom of heaven is at hand, as in it's in the present tense, and he preached in synagogue. And so when you look at this in that context, as in we had him preach in synagogue, and the evangelist said kingdom of heaven is at hand. When I put these two verses together in that context, yes, now by being a miracle worker, he's also being the Messiah, or by being the Messiah, he's a miracle worker. And as you've noticed, being a miracle worker involves a change in either physical or the spiritual reality. In this case, he's doing both. As in the earlier case was healing folks, healing them spiritually, and in this case, he's also healing them physically.
Yeah, 100%. And it leads to a couple questions on our part. I want to tell you like really short, a famous quote. This is from the Chilta of Rabbi Yishmael. It says, "A maidservant saw at the sea, when the sea split for the Israelites to cross the splitting of the sea, what Isaiah the prophet, and what Ezekiel, the prophet, did not say. See, so we have this idea that certain people had amazing access to God's, like, God information at different times, and even more so than what the prophets had. And yet, what happens after splitting the sea? They go to Mount Sinai and they sin, and they say they make a golden calf. And I think in general, there's this idea that even though the whole nation saw the splitting of the sea, saw the greatest miracle and saving of them that they could experience, it didn't lead to a long-lasting impact on their understanding of God or the world. So I think, like, we could actually have a really great parallel to here, that if you want to say that Jesus is doing miracles in order, like Luke says, so he has disciples, a great crowd, great multiple people, or if you just say he's doing it because his fame spread throughout and people are coming to him, what we see, though, and I think this is maybe foreshadowing the reality, that this is meaningless in the long term. What we see from Jewish tradition is that prophets don't accomplish that, messiahs don't accomplish that. There's actually a really famous line from Yeshaya Leibowitz where he said the greatest failed venture in the history of the world is prophets, because prophets go and tell you to do stuff, you do it, you get what you can out of them, and then you throw it away. And if you look, there's also another famous midrash in Judaism that in the time of Messiah, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, will be kept, and Joshua, but but except for one more, all the other books of the prophets will be thrown away. Because prophets are a failed venture. People who cure you, it's only as good as it lasts. So it's really interesting that it's almost like they're getting a free hot dog. They're like, yay, I'll take what I can get. But I think Jewish tradition teaches us that miracles don't last in the mind of the beholder, and they become meaningless over time.
Yeah. So okay. Well, yeah. That's very well put, and that's very well said. Thank you for that. The miracles in the long run, they don't. Again, they don't have the standing power.
What
They're
did you
there.
do for me now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so it's less about miracle. That's just a reflection of human capacity, of our, of human nature, that we are, by nature, people who forget. I don't remember what I had 3 weeks
I
ago.
never forget what I get from you, Isaac. I value that relationship.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. So what was the evangelist trying to say then? So, as you notice, the prophets, miracle workers don't have any staying power. These miracles from Jesus probably
You
didn't
don't
think
have to
much.
ask on Jesus. You can ask on the whole Old Testament. The whole Tanakh
Yeah,
has, after Joshua came, then you have you have the time period of the judges, and you have the time period of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Samuel, and prophet after prophet comes until you hit Ezra, or like in Malachi. So even though it's a failed venture, that was the way the world worked until it stopped. So
so
I
what
don't think
was the
you can ask why your prophets not listened to? Why is it failed venture? That was the way the world worked until it didn't work that way.
Mhm. Okay, so it sounds like from this passage you're saying Jesus is a Messiah, he healed people, and he proclaimed the gospel, and his fame spread throughout Syria. And
It
combining
doesn't
these,
say he's the Messiah here, but
well,
I'm not trying to
it's
read.
kind of
I'm just saying
implied.
that
It's
I'm not trying to even imply anything. I'm just saying, like, when people who heal sick people are viewed as special, and maybe this could be viewed messianically by the Matthean community as they're reading this, and I think that would be
uh,
meaningful, especially as it says in Syria. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if somebody healed me, I would think that they're special too. Again, if people had
When a
sickness,
doctor
people
heals
had
you,
illness.
you pay a bill and you walk away. You never talk again until you need medicine or healing again. So I just don't think that's real. I think we see all the time. I don't know if this is true. I read that there was and this is horrible if it's true. I read that a staff member donated her kidney to her boss, but because she was taking so long to heal, he fired her. And I don't know if that's true. I read it like a couple days ago, and I think there's no better way to, like, set up a parallel or a paradigm or a muscle for this than that. Like, the people, they specifically came to him because his fame spread. They heard about it, but it doesn't say what it meant to them yet. It
That's
just
right.
says,
It doesn't say that they believed in him. It doesn't say, as you said, it does not mention what it meant to them or if this made any difference in their lives.
okay,
Well, it made a physical difference, but it doesn't say further beyond that.
okay. The last thing, because I actually have to go in a couple seconds, but the last thing I just want to discuss to make you happy is at least the idea. This is going to be the most Christian, out of context thing I can imagine. But I think if a Christian would read this,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
would read this, they would say, it's not that he healed them of their sins, they healed the disease. It's that Jesus specifically pardons or heals or atones for your sins. That's one thing he does. And because in the first century, specifically sin was viewed as the main cause of health. And even today, we see all the time that a rabbi who's a fundamentalist will say, you know why that you can't have children? It's because you looked at women, or you know why that the Holocaust happened? Because there's too many people who aren't keeping mitzvahs,
Well,
or you know why the
it's a God
tornado.
of the gaps. It's a God of the gaps theology. We don't have a reason, so we kind of put this on the things we know to
No, no,
say.
no, no. God of the gaps is much more scientific. I'm saying this is
Okay.
the opposite of God of the gaps. In the olden days and throughout the Bible, sin is viewed as the reason for non-health. You are punished
Mhm.
because you sin. So, and therefore, if Jesus is Jesus from a Christian read, then Jesus specifically should make people healed in the first century because he should get rid of their sins. And I think that'd be like, again, I just want to point out, I'm not
But
saying
that is not. But that is not a math. But that is not. But that is not a Matthean interpretation. I don't think Matthew would say that. Do you think? Would you think Matthew would say that?
I don't. I'm just noting, and I have to go in a second.
That's
I'm,
a this
I'm
is a
just noting.
contemporary 21st century Americans interpretation of what this verse
No,
is
no,
mean.
but I do think in the first century they would have seen health as a consequence of sin.
Yeah.
So I just want to note that again. Like I think you have to ask yourself, why is he curing the sick? That's our opening question. Of all the miracles and amazing things he could have done, he could have floated in the sky, walked on water, whatever his first thing he wanted to do. But he specifically is curing, and I think that has to do about the way that he wants to frame his ministry. But and again, that's maybe what you're talking about. Maybe this is how we want to live in messianic times, or maybe the fact that the most immediate pain in your life he's going to take care of. But I do think we have to always think that why, like just like he picked up disciples in that way, this is the first time he's kind of interacting with the masses, and this is what he does. And I think that always has to be in the back of our mind that that's just like John frames Jesus. The way Jesus frames his ministry is starting by curing the sick in the Matthean community. Okay, Isaac, I have to run.
On that note, okay, Rabbi, thank you. Have a great day. To be